August 4th, 1943, the ship lurched into Norfolk Harbor at dawn, and Unteroffizier Hans Müller pressed his face against the porthole, his breath fogging the salt-crusted glass. 2 weeks in the belly of a Liberty ship, 14 days of nausea and uncertainty, of whispered fears about what awaited them in America. And now, the moment had arrived. Behind him, packed into the converted cargo hold with 800 other men from Rommel's once proud Afrika Korps, soldiers shifted in their bunks, silent except for the metallic clink of belt buckles and the shuffle of boots on steel decking. Müller's stomach was full. This detail alone seemed impossible, almost obscene. Not hungry, for the first time since El Alamein. Not hungry. The Americans had served them 3 meals yesterday, actual meals with meat and vegetables, not the watery soup and black bread of the transit camp in Algeria. His uniform, once crisp and intimidating in the desert sun, hung loose on his frame, but the rations aboard this ship had been generous, bewildering, as if the Americans either didn't understand scarcity or didn't care about imposing it. "What do you see?" Gefreiter Klaus Weber asked from the bunk below, his voice tight with something between anticipation and dread. Müller didn't answer immediately. Through the porthole, he watched the American coastline materialize in the gray morning light. Warehouses lined the waterfront, massive and numerous. Cranes towered over the docks like steel giants, and beyond them the city stretched in all directions, buildings intact, no bomb craters, no rubble, no skeletal remains of what once was. It looked exactly like Hamburg had looked in 1938, before everything changed, before everything burned. "It's all still standing," Müller finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ship's horn bellowed, a deep sound that reverberated through the hull. The engines reversed, and the Liberty ship shuddered as it began its final approach to the dock. Around them, men gathered their meager possessions, letters from home that would never arrive, photographs creased from being folded and unfolded, the small dignity of personal objects in a world stripped of dignity. Obergefreiter Ernst Hartmann, a veteran of Poland and France before Africa, lit a cigarette, his last American cigarette from the pack they'd been given 2 days ago. He inhaled deeply, held it, exhaled slowly. "I thought," he said to no one in particular, "that we would see destruction. I thought that's what war looked like everywhere now." But it didn't. As the men filed up onto the deck in the pale morning sunlight, the full scope of what they were seeing became undeniable. Norfolk stretched before them, pristine and prosperous. Automobiles, dozens of them, hundreds, moved along the visible streets. Not military vehicles alone, but civilian cars, driving freely as if gasoline grew on trees. As if there were no rationing, no shortages, no sacrifices being demanded of every citizen for the war effort. "Impossible," someone muttered behind Müller, but it was possible. It was real. And as they stood there, 800 men in desert-stained Afrika Korps uniforms with the sun warming their shoulders, each of them confronted the same terrible question. If this was America, if this abundance, this normalcy, this untouched prosperity was what they were fighting against, what had they been told? What had they believed? The propaganda and the truth. For 5 years, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had painted a picture of America that every German soldier knew by heart. The United States was a mongrel nation in terminal decline, rotting from within through racial mixing and capitalist excess. Its people were soft, pampered by Jewish-controlled finance, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that true warriors understood. Its economy was a house of cards ready to collapse under the strain of mobilization. Its military was a paper tiger, untested and untrained, no match for the battle-hardened legions of the Reich. The men of the Afrika Korps had absorbed these lessons through newspapers, through radio broadcasts, through the endless repetition that makes propaganda effective. They had seen the newsreels showing breadlines in American cities during the Depression, had heard the statistics about unemployment and poverty. They had been assured time and again that Germany's cause was just and Germany's victory inevitable because their enemies were fundamentally weak. Now they stood on American soil, and the cognitive dissonance was physically painful. The delousing process came first, standard procedure. The Americans explained in German through their translators. The men stripped, submitted to the chemical showers, received clean undergarments that felt impossibly soft after months of the same sweat-stained clothes. They were processed through stations where their names were recorded, their ranks noted, their personal effects cataloged. The American soldiers who supervised them were neither cruel nor particularly kind. They were methodical, efficient, bored even, like workers at a factory processing another batch of raw material. "Move along," an American sergeant said in heavily accented German. "You'll board the train in 1 hour." The train. Müller had expected freight cars, the same boxcars that had transported them during their service in the Wehrmacht. 60 men crammed into a car designed for 40, standing for hours or days, relieving themselves through gaps in the floorboards, arriving at their destinations exhausted and dehumanized. That was how armies moved prisoners. That was how logistics worked in wartime. But when they reached the platform, what waited for them bore no resemblance to freight cars. Christ in heaven, Weber breathed. Passenger cars. Not just passenger cars, Pullman coaches with upholstered seats and clean windows. The kind of train one took for a holiday, not for a journey into captivity. The men hesitated, confused, looking to their officers for guidance, but even the officers seemed bewildered. "Board the train," the American sergeant repeated. "Find a seat. The porter will bring coffee." The porter will bring coffee. Müller climbed aboard, his boots loud on the metal steps. Inside, the coach was everything the exterior had promised. Comfortable seats arranged in rows, overhead luggage racks, reading lights at each position. He sank into a seat by the window, feeling the cushioning give beneath him. And for a moment, he simply sat there, unable to process what was happening. Weber dropped into the seat beside him. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "Something is wrong. This is too good." "Maybe it's a mistake," Müller suggested. "Maybe these are the wrong cars." But it wasn't a mistake. All 800 men boarded similar coaches, and when the train lurched into motion 30 minutes later, beginning its journey southwest toward Camp Clinton in Mississippi, a black porter, the first black person many of these German soldiers had ever seen in person, walked down the aisle with a cart, offering coffee and sandwiches. "Would you gentlemen like something to eat?" he asked in English, his tone polite, professional. Most of the men couldn't understand the words, but the gesture was universal. Food, offered freely. The porter didn't sneer or spit or show contempt. He simply smiled, a practiced service industry smile, and waited for their response. Hartman, sitting across the aisle, took a cup of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper. He unwrapped it slowly, as if it might vanish. White bread, actual white bread. Not the coarse, dark stuff they'd eaten for years. Ham, cheese, a smear of mayonnaise. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed, his eyes closed. "How long since you had white bread?" Müller asked. Hartman didn't open his eyes. 1940, maybe 1941. Before they changed the rations, the train carried them through Virginia, through the Shenandoah Valley, where autumn was beginning to paint the leaves in shades of rust and gold. They pressed their faces to the windows, watching the landscape unfold. Farms dotted the countryside, their fields green and productive. Barns stood solid and painted. Houses had intact roofs and straight chimneys. Small towns appeared and disappeared, their main streets lined with businesses. Hardware stores, grocers, cafes, all apparently open and operating. "Where are the bomb craters?" someone asked from the back of the coach. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out buildings, no rubble, no evidence that this nation was at war at all, except for the occasional sight of a military convoy on a parallel road. The contrast with Europe, with Germany, with France, with every place these men had seen in the past 4 years was so stark that it bordered on the surreal. At night, they passed through small towns that still had lights in their windows. Lights. In Germany, the blackout had been absolute since 1939. Every window covered, every street lamp dark, the whole nation holding its breath in darkness, hoping the bombers wouldn't come. But here, in America, lights spilled carelessly into the night. Electric signs glowed. Car headlights swept freely along the roads. It was as if war was something that happened elsewhere, to other people. Müller watched the lights slide past and thought about Hamburg, about his mother in their apartment in Altona, sitting in darkness after sundown, rationing her coal, stretching her food stamps to last the month. He thought about his sister in Munich, writing letters that arrived months late and were half-censored. He thought about the propaganda posters showing American soldiers as incompetent buffoons and American citizens as starving degenerates. The lies were so enormous that they became almost impossible to believe. And yet, here was the truth, undeniable, rushing past his window at 60 miles per hour. "What are we fighting?" Weber asked beside him so quietly that Müller almost didn't hear. It was the question they were all asking silently, each man alone with his thoughts. If America looked like this, if it could feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers, if it could transport captives in comfort while fighting a two-front war, what chance had the Reich ever had? What had all the sacrifice been for? Müller had no answer. He only pressed his hand against the window glass, feeling the warmth still radiating from the day's sun, and watched the prosperous American landscape roll past in the gathering darkness. Camp Clinton, the Golden Cage. They arrived at Camp Clinton on August 6, 1943, 2 days after leaving Norfolk. The camp sat 3 miles outside Jackson, Mississippi, on land that had been farmland before the military requisitioned it. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in geometric precision, surrounded by guard towers and multiple layers of barbed wire fence. It looked like a proper prison camp, and this, at least, matched their expectations. But expectations, they were learning, were unreliable things. The camp commandant, Colonel James Morrison, addressed them through an interpreter on their first evening. He was a tall man with gray at his temples, West Point educated, career military. He stood on a raised platform and spoke in clipped, formal tones, while the interpreter rendered his words into German. "You are prisoners of war," Morrison said. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers. You will be paid for your labor at the same rate as American privates. You will have access to medical care, to education, to recreation. Your quarters will meet the standards required by international law." The men listened in silence. Some looked skeptical, others simply looked tired. "We expect you to conduct yourselves as soldiers," Morrison continued. "You will maintain discipline within your own ranks. Your officers will continue to command your units within the limits of camp regulations. Any man who attempts to escape will be punished, but not shot unless he poses an immediate threat to American lives. Are there questions?" There were no questions. What questions could they ask? They were prisoners in a foreign land, separated from everything they knew by an ocean and an unbridgeable gulf of defeat. That first night, they slept in the barracks on cots with mattresses, actual mattresses, not straw pallets, and blankets that didn't smell of mildew. The barracks were heated, though the Mississippi August needed no heat. They had running water, latrines that flushed, shower facilities with hot water. The camp had been designed to house 3,000 men, and every regulation from Geneva had been observed. "It's better than the barracks in Hamburg," Weber said in the darkness, his voice carrying across the quiet room. No one disagreed. The daily routine established itself quickly. Reveille at 600, roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and free time until lights out at 2200. The work was agricultural. Mississippi farms had been stripped of labor as young men enlisted or were drafted, and German POW labor helped fill that gap. The men harvested cotton, picked vegetables, maintained equipment, worked in canneries processing the produce they picked. They were paid 80 cents a day, deposited into accounts they could draw from at the camp canteen. It wasn't much by American standards, but it was more than most had ever had as spending money. At the canteen, they could purchase cigarettes, candy, writing paper, toiletries. The cigarettes were American brands, Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, and they cost a fraction of what black market cigarettes cost in Germany. The candy was chocolate that tasted like actual chocolate, not the ersatz mixtures of sawdust and chemicals they'd choked down for years. Müller remembered standing in the canteen for the first time, staring at the shelves, Coca-Cola in glass bottles, ice cream available by the scoop, magazines, playing cards, soap, razor blades, all of it accessible, purchasable, abundant. "What would you like?" the German-speaking American administrator asked. "I don't know," Müller said honestly. The wealth of choice paralyzed him. He eventually bought chocolate, a toothbrush, and writing paper. That night, he sat in the barracks and tried to compose a letter to his mother. What could he tell her? That he was imprisoned in America and living better than most civilians in Hamburg? That his captors fed him 3 meals a day? That he slept in a heated building? That he could purchase chocolate whenever he wanted? "Dear Mother," he wrote, "I am well, the food is adequate, and the camp conditions are acceptable. I think of you often and hope this war ends soon so I can return home. Your loving son, Hans." He folded the letter, addressed it carefully, and left it for the censor. 3/4 of what he wanted to say remained locked inside him, unspeakable. The food haunted them all. The mess hall served meals that would have been considered generous in peacetime Germany, let alone wartime. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and coffee with real sugar. Lunch might be sandwiches with meat and cheese, accompanied by fruit, actual fresh fruit. Dinner was a full meal: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. "They're trying to fatten us for some purpose," Hartmann joked one evening, patting his steadily expanding belly. But there was an edge to his humor. The abundance disturbed them. It violated everything they thought they understood about war. American soldiers ate the same food. The prisoners saw the guards eating in their own mess hall, and the portions looked identical. There was no distinction, no evidence that the Americans were starving themselves to feed their captives. They simply had enough food for everyone, soldiers and prisoners alike, with apparently no limit to the supply. Where did it come from? The question obsessed them. Mississippi was agricultural land, yes, but surely not so productive that it could feed millions while exporting to England and supplying forces overseas. Yet the evidence was undeniable. American agriculture was so efficient, so mechanized, so productive that food was never a concern. What had taken 5 German farmers to produce, 1 American farmer could produce alone, with machinery. "They have tractors," Weber reported one day after working in a cotton field. "Huge ones. One man operating a machine does the work of 20 men with hand tools. And when it breaks, if it breaks, they just replace the parts. They don't improvise or make do. They replace them. New parts from a factory that makes nothing but tractor parts." This was the invisible architecture of American power, and it dwarfed anything the Reich had created. Not the tanks or planes or ships, though those were formidable, but the underlying industrial capacity that could produce weapons while simultaneously maintaining civilian prosperity. Germany had sacrificed butter for guns. America apparently produced both without choosing. The re-education confronting cognitive dissonance. In November 1943, the camp administration began showing films. This was presented as recreation entertainment to pass the long evenings. The first films were innocuous: cartoons, newsreels about baseball, travelogues showing the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. The men watched and enjoyed them. Then came the other films. On November 20th, they were assembled in the camp theater, a large wooden building with a projection screen and folding chairs. Colonel Morrison addressed them briefly before the film began. "What you are about to see is documentary footage shot by Allied forces. I'm not showing this to torture you or to propagandize you. I'm showing it because you deserve to know the truth about what your government has done." The lights dimmed. The projector began to whir. The footage showed concentration camps: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Not the labor camps they'd heard about in whispers, but something far worse. Bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons in striped uniforms, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, crematoria working around the clock, the industrial apparatus of genocide. Men vomited in their seats. Others wept. Some simply sat frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Müller watched with his hands gripping the armrest, his knuckles white, his stomach churning. "Propaganda," someone hissed from the back. "Allied propaganda, lies." But the footage kept rolling. British soldiers liberating camps, American soldiers bearing witness, survivors testifying. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, meticulously documented. When the lights came back on, the room sat in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. "I know this is difficult," Colonel Morrison said. "I know many of you don't want to believe it. But this is what your nation did, in your name, while you fought in Africa. These camps operated throughout the war. Millions died in them. This is documented fact." Hartmann stood up, his face pale. "Permission to return to the barracks, sir." Granted. Half the room filed out behind him, the other half remained seated, still processing. Miller sat among them, staring at the blank screen, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what he'd believed about his country, about his service, about the war. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1937, young and idealistic. He had believed in Germany's revival, in the rectification of Versailles' injustices. He had believed that National Socialism, whatever its rougher edges, represented a new order that would restore German dignity. He had fought for that belief in Poland, in France, in Africa. Now, in a prison camp in Mississippi, that belief system was dissolving like wet paper. The re-education program continued over the following months. Films about American democracy, classes on the Weimar Republic's failures and the Nazi Party's rise to power, discussions about constitutional government, about the rule of law, about individual rights versus collective obligation. The Americans called it education. Some of the prisoners called it brainwashing. But it wasn't the films or classes that changed minds. It was the daily experience of American life, filtered through the peculiar lens of captivity. It was the guards who treated them with professional courtesy rather than hatred. The farmers who shared meals with them in the fields and asked about their families. The townspeople of Jackson who looked at them with curiosity rather than rage. The Protestant minister who came to camp every Sunday and preached about forgiveness and redemption. It was the newspapers they could read in the camp library, American newspapers, uncensored, critical of their own government in ways that would have been unthinkable in Germany. Articles questioning military strategy, editorials debating wartime policies, letters to the editor expressing dissent, all published freely without fear of retribution. How can they allow this? Weber asked one evening, holding up a newspaper. This article criticizes Roosevelt's decisions. In Germany, the author would be arrested. Here, it's on the front page. That's how democracy works, Miller said quietly. He'd been reading more, thinking more, questioning the assumptions he'd carried his entire adult life. Citizens are allowed to disagree with their government. But doesn't that create weakness? Division? Maybe. Or maybe it creates resilience. A system that can handle criticism, that can change course when wrong, that doesn't require everyone to believe the same thing. It was a radical thought, almost treasonous. But treason against what? A regime that had lied to them systematically? A government that had committed atrocities while telling its soldiers they fought for civilization? Not all the prisoners underwent this transformation. Some remained dedicated Nazis, true believers who dismissed everything they saw as Allied propaganda and deception. These men congregated together, reinforcing each other's certainties, punishing any prisoner who seemed too friendly with the Americans. They organized their own kangaroo courts, dispensing rough justice to traitors. In March 1944, a prisoner named Werner Drexler was beaten to death by 7 fellow POWs at Camp Papago Park in Arizona. His crime, cooperating too enthusiastically with the Americans, sharing information about submarine tactics. The 7 men who killed him were eventually hanged, but their actions represented a darker current that ran through the camps. Not all Germans were willing to surrender their old beliefs. The camp administrators at Clinton recognized this division and acted on it. Known Nazi fanatics were transferred to specialized camps in Oklahoma and elsewhere, segregated from the general population. This reduced tensions but couldn't eliminate them entirely. Every prisoner faced a choice: cling to the old certainties or accept uncomfortable truths. The choice was rarely easy. Labor, community, and unexpected connections. By the spring of 1944, nearly 380,000 German POWs were spread across 500 camps in the United States. They provided critical labor for an economy stripped of manpower by the draft. In Mississippi alone, POWs worked in cotton fields, lumber mills, food processing plants, and construction sites. They weren't slaves. Geneva Convention regulations ensured they were paid, fed adequately, and not forced into military production work, but they were undeniably valuable to the American war effort. Miller found himself assigned to a farm outside Edwards, Mississippi, owned by a man named Thomas Crawford. Crawford was 62, too old for the draft, and running a 200-acre cotton operation mostly by himself. After his 2 sons enlisted, he needed workers, and the POW labor program provided them. The first time Miller met Crawford, the old farmer looked him up and down critically. "You know anything about cotton?" Crawford asked through the camp translator. "No, sir," Miller replied. Well, you're about to learn. Cotton doesn't pick itself. They worked 6 days a week from dawn to mid-afternoon, with breaks for water and lunch. The labor was hard, back-breaking even, but not punishing. Crawford set quotas, 36 boxes per man per day, but didn't drive them brutally. He provided good tools, maintained safe working conditions, and treated them, as Müller would later write in his diary, like hired hands rather than enemies. The lunch breaks were where the walls began to come down. Crawford's wife, Mary, brought food to the field, sandwiches, lemonade, sometimes cookies still warm from the oven. She spoke no German, the prisoners spoke limited English, but communication happened anyway. A smile, a gesture of thanks, the universal language of shared meals. One day in May, Crawford sat down beside Müller during the lunch break. They ate in companionable silence for a while, then Crawford spoke. "My boys are in Europe," he said. "Fighting." Müller understood enough English now to grasp the meaning. He nodded. "Hope they get treated decent if they're captured," Crawford continued. "Hope some German farmer is feeding them lunch and not working them to death." "I hope so too," Müller said carefully in English. Crawford looked at him, really looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're just a kid. How old are you?" 24. "My youngest is 22. Crawford shook his head. This whole damn war, boys killing boys because old men couldn't figure out how to talk to each other. It was a simple sentiment, almost trite, but in that moment, sitting in a Mississippi cotton field in May 1944, it felt profound. Müller thought about his own father, who had died in France in 1940. He thought about his brother, still fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front. He thought about all the families on both sides, German and American, British and French and Russian, all mourning sons and fathers and brothers. "I am sorry," Müller said, his English halting. "About war, about everything." Crawford nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too, son. Me too." These small moments of connection happened everywhere, repeated across 500 camps in dozens of states. A German POW teaching a farmer's son to play chess. An American guard sharing photographs of his family with a prisoner who shared photographs of his own. A town minister visiting the camp to conduct services and finding, to his surprise, that Germans sang hymns with the same fervor as Americans. The citizens of Jackson initially had mixed feelings about the camp's presence. Some wrote angry letters to the War Department, protesting the coddling of enemies. Why should German prisoners eat well when American soldiers were fighting and dying overseas? Why should they receive medical care and recreation when Americans faced rationing and sacrifice? The government's response was consistent. Compliance with the Geneva Convention ensured that American POWs held by Germany received similar treatment. It was self-interest, not generosity, that motivated decent treatment of prisoners. This argument mollified some critics, but not all. Still, Jackson's economy benefited from Camp Clinton. Businesses sold goods to the camp. Guards and administrators spent their salaries in local shops and restaurants. The prisoners' labor helped maintain agricultural production that might otherwise have collapsed. Economic self-interest often succeeds where moral argument fails. By late 1944, something remarkable had happened at Camp Clinton and camps like it across America. The boundaries between captor and captive had blurred, not enough to eliminate the fundamental reality of imprisonment, but enough to create genuine human connections. Guards learned prisoners' names, asked about their families, shared cigarettes during breaks. Prisoners learned English, absorbed American customs, began to understand this strange nation that held them. "It's like we're living in a parallel world," Weber said one evening. "In Europe, our comrades are fighting and dying. Here, we're playing softball and eating ice cream. How do we make sense of that?" Müller had no answer. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. He felt guilty for being comfortable, for eating well, for sleeping safely while men he'd served with faced bullets and bombs. But he also felt grateful, impossibly grateful, to be here rather than fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front or defending Germany against the Allied bombing campaign. His survival depended on his captivity, and that paradox was impossible to resolve. The end of war and the beginning of something else. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. At Camp Clinton, the prisoners received the news in stunned silence. After 6 years of conflict, after millions of deaths, after the destruction of entire cities and the reshaping of the world order, it was simply over. Germany had lost, the Reich had fallen. Everything they'd fought for had been in vain. Some men wept, others sat stone-faced, processing the enormity of what had happened. A few celebrated quietly, relieved that the dying had finally stopped. Most simply felt numb. "What happens to us now?" someone asked. No one knew. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners after hostilities ended, but the logistics of returning 380,000 men to a devastated Germany took time. The camps remained operational through 1945 and into 1946, their populations gradually decreasing as ships became available for transport. But something had changed with VE Day. The prisoners were no longer enemies. Exactly. They were defeated soldiers from a defeated nation, held not for security, but for bureaucratic necessity. The guard rotations became more relaxed. Work assignments continued, but the atmosphere shifted. They were waiting, all of them, prisoners and guards alike, for this peculiar chapter to end. The re-education program intensified during these final months. Films about the Nuremberg trials, detailed documentation of Nazi atrocities, lectures about democracy and constitutional government. The Americans wanted to send these men home as witnesses, as carriers of truth who could help rebuild Germany on different foundations. For many, the education was unnecessary. Daily life in America had taught them lessons that no film could equal. They had seen democracy in action. They had experienced relative prosperity even as prisoners. They had encountered Americans who treated them as human beings deserving of dignity. These experiences couldn't be erased by propaganda or wishful thinking. Müller thought often about what awaited him in Hamburg. His mother's letters, which had resumed after VE Day, painted a grim picture. The city was ruins. Food was scarce. Housing was devastated. The occupation authorities were struggling to maintain order. Germany faced years, perhaps decades of rebuilding. And yet, he had hope. Not naive hope. He understood the enormity of Germany's crimes and the depth of its defeat. But he had seen that nations could be prosperous and free simultaneously. He had seen that democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, created resilient societies. He had learned that the propaganda he'd absorbed his entire adult life had been lies, and if those lies could be dismantled, perhaps new truths could be built. In September 1945, Thomas Crawford visited the camp. He'd gotten permission from the commandant to say goodbye to some of the workers who'd spent 2 years on his farm. He found Müller in the recreation area reading an English-language newspaper. "Heard you're shipping out next month," Crawford said. "Yes, sir. Finally going home. Germany's pretty rough right now, from what I hear." "Yes, sir, but it's home." Crawford handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For the journey, some food, some cigarettes, and there's an address in there. Mine. If you ever need help, if things get too bad, you write to me. I'll do what I can." Müller stared at the package, overwhelmed. "Mr. Crawford, I don't make a big thing of it. Just take care of yourself. And try to do some good over there. Help rebuild things the right way." They shook hands, and Crawford left. Müller opened the package later, alone in his bunk. Inside were practical items, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, soap. But there was also a letter, written in Crawford's careful handwriting. "Dear Hans, we don't pick our enemies or choose our wars, but we can choose how we treat each other and what we build afterward. Go home and help make a better Germany. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing is. Your friend, Thomas Crawford." Müller folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, next to the photograph of his mother. He would keep it for the rest of his life, a testament to a strange friendship forged in the crucible of war. October 1945. The journey home. The Liberty ship that carried Müller and 800 other former POWs back to Europe left Norfolk on October 15, 1945. It was the same port where they'd arrived 26 months earlier, but everything had changed. They were no longer prisoners now. They were repatriated soldiers, going home to a nation that no longer existed in the form they'd known. The journey was rough. Autumn storms lashed the Atlantic, and the ship pitched and rolled through gray seas. Men who'd grown accustomed to solid ground and regular meals found themselves seasick and miserable. But there was also an undercurrent of anticipation. After more than 2 years, they were going home. Müller stood on deck one evening, watching the sun set over the western horizon. America lay behind them now, receding into memory. He thought about Camp Clinton, about the Crawfords, about the guards he'd come to know by name. He thought about the comfortable barracks and the abundant food and the strange experience of being imprisoned in a nation so prosperous that even its captives lived better than most free Germans. Weber joined him at the rail, thinking about Mississippi, thinking about everything, about how wrong we were, about how much the propaganda lied to us. You going to tell people? When we get back? I don't know. Who would believe us? We were POWs in America for 2 years and gained weight. We were fed better than soldiers. We were treated with respect. It sounds insane, but it's true. Truth isn't always welcome, especially when it contradicts everything people want to believe. They stood in silence, watching the darkness spread across the ocean. The ship's engines throbbed beneath their feet, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Germany, when they finally reached it in early November, exceeded their worst fears. Hamburg was devastated. The Allied bombing campaign had reduced whole neighborhoods to rubble. People lived in cellars and bombed out buildings. Food was desperately scarce. Rations provided barely 1,000 calories per day, far below subsistence level. The black market thrived, but few had anything to trade. Everything from soap to clothing to medicine was in critically short supply. Müller's mother had survived, living in 2 rooms of a building where the upper floors had been destroyed. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds. When he appeared at her door, she stared at him in disbelief. "Hans, is it really you?" "Yes, Mutter. I'm home." She burst into tears and pulled him inside. He towered over her now, his own weight having settled at a healthy 165 pounds. After 2 years of American rations, he'd brought everything from Crawford's package that he hadn't consumed on the journey, and when he unpacked the chocolate and crackers and cigarettes, his mother gasped. "Where did you get these?" "Hans, you didn't steal." "No, Mutter, an American farmer gave them to me." "As a gift." She looked at him skeptically. "An American gave you gifts?" "It's a long story, but yes, Americans can be generous." Over the following days and weeks, he told her everything about the camps, the food, the treatment, the re-education programs, the friendships. She listened with growing amazement, sometimes skeptical, sometimes horrified, always attentive. "They showed you films," she asked, "about the camps?" "Yes, about what the Nazis did, the concentration camps, the genocide. They showed us proof, Mutter, documented proof." She was silent for a long time. Finally, she said, "We heard rumors during the war, but we didn't know. We didn't want to know. It was easier to believe it was Allied propaganda." "It wasn't propaganda. I saw the footage. I heard survivors testify. It was real, all of it." "God help us," she whispered. "What did we allow to happen?" That question would haunt Germany for generations. But in that moment, in that destroyed city, in that shattered nation, Müller could only hold his mother and feel grateful that both of them had survived. The Long Echo. Post-war lives. Hans Müller lived for another 53 years after returning to Germany. He never returned to America, but he never forgot it either. He worked as a translator for the British occupation forces, then as a clerk in the new West German government. He married in 1948, had 3 children, and built a modest but comfortable life in the ruins of Hamburg. He kept in contact with Thomas Crawford until the farmer's death in 1967. Their correspondence was sporadic but genuine. Christmas cards, occasional letters updating each other on their families and lives. When Crawford died, his son sent Müller a letter with a photograph. Crawford in his old age, standing in the same cotton field where he and Müller had worked together in 1944. "Dad talked about you guys sometimes," the son wrote. "The German POWs who worked his farm during the war. He said you were decent men caught in a bad situation, and he was glad he could help in some small way. He kept your letters. They're in his papers now, part of the family history." Müller framed that photograph and hung it in his study. When his children asked about it, he told them the story, how he'd been captured in North Africa, transported to America, and discovered that the enemy he'd been taught to hate was far more complex than propaganda allowed, how a Mississippi farmer had treated him with basic human dignity. how that experience had changed his understanding of the world. His youngest son Thomas, named after Crawford, would later write a doctoral dissertation on German POWs in America during World War II. He interviewed dozens of survivors, including his father, and uncovered a remarkable pattern. The vast majority of German POWs who spent time in American camps retained positive memories of their experience and credited that time with reshaping their political and social beliefs. One former POW, quoted in Thomas Müller's dissertation, said it perfectly. "We arrived in America as National Socialists and left as Democrats, not because the Americans brainwashed us, but because they showed us through their actions and their society that there was a better way to organize human affairs. We saw democracy working. We saw prosperity that didn't require conquering others. We saw freedom that didn't breed chaos. Those lessons couldn't be unlearned." Not every German POW underwent this transformation. Some remained convinced Nazis, unrepentant, and bitter. Some simply survived their captivity without engaging with it intellectually or emotionally. But a significant number, estimates suggest as many as 100,000 men, returned to Germany with changed perspectives that would influence post-war reconstruction. These men became teachers, civil servants, businessmen, politicians. They raised children who grew up in democratic West Germany. They supported the Marshall Plan and European integration. They helped build the new Germany from the ruins of the old, carrying with them lessons learned in American prison camps. The irony was profound. America's treatment of German POWs, motivated by Geneva Convention obligations and practical considerations, accidentally created a cadre of witnesses who could testify to democracy's viability. The re-education that the Army attempted through films and classes was far less effective than the simple experience of living in American society, even as prisoners. Klaus Weber, who'd been captured alongside Müller in Tunisia, returned to Germany and became a secondary school teacher in Frankfurt. He taught history and civics, and according to his former students, he always spent time on World War II, always emphasized the importance of international law and human rights, and always told stories about his time as a POW in Colorado. He wanted us to understand, one student recalled decades later, that nations are judged not just by how they treat their friends, but by how they treat their enemies. He said America won the war not just with weapons, but with values, and that Germany needed to learn from that. Ernst Hartmann, the veteran who'd lit that last cigarette on the ship to Norfolk, settled in Munich after the war. He became involved in local politics, served on the city council, and worked tirelessly to establish sister city relationships with American communities. In 1965, he traveled to the United States for the first time since his repatriation, visiting the Colorado camp where he'd spent his final year of captivity. The camp was gone, demolished after the war, its land returned to farming, but Hartmann walked the fields anyway, remembering. "I was angry when I was captured," he told a journalist who accompanied him. "I thought my life was over. But looking back, being captured saved me. It removed me from a war machine that was committing atrocities. It placed me in an environment where I could learn different values. It gave me a second chance. Not every soldier gets that." Reckoning with memory. The story of German POWs in America remained largely forgotten in American popular consciousness. Unlike the dramatic battles or the Holocaust or the atomic bombs, POW camps lacked the narrative power to capture public imagination. They were bureaucratic necessities, efficiently managed according to international law, neither triumphs nor tragedies. But in academic circles and among historians, the subject gained attention over the decades. By the 1980s and 1990s, scholars were interviewing aging survivors, examining archival records, reconstructing the experience. What they found challenged simplistic narratives about World War II. The war wasn't just good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, though those elements certainly existed. It was also a massive human migration, with 425,000 German prisoners transported across an ocean to a nation they'd been taught to despise. It was a practical exercise in international law, with the Geneva Convention forcing combatants to treat each other with minimum standards of dignity. It was an accidental experiment in cultural exchange, with prisoners and captors learning from each other despite the fundamental inequality of their relationship. The economic dimension also deserved attention. German POW labor helped maintain American agricultural production during the war, generating millions of dollars in economic value. Farmers and businesses benefited directly. The government profited indirectly through increased tax revenues and maintained production. Even the prisoners benefited somewhat. They were paid, however modestly, fed well, and kept safe from combat. It was exploitation, certainly, but exploitation bounded by law and softened by prosperity. The racial dimension added another layer of complexity. German POWs, even as enemies, were generally treated better than African American citizens in many parts of the United States. In the Jim Crow South, German prisoners could sit at lunch counters where Black Americans couldn't. They could use facilities marked whites only. They were protected by international law in ways that Black Americans weren't protected by their own constitution. This produced strange moments of recognition and shame. Some German POWs, particularly those who worked alongside Black agricultural workers or were guarded by Black soldiers, commented on American racial hypocrisy. The nation that proclaimed itself the land of freedom maintained an apartheid system in its southern states. The cognitive dissonance cut both ways. Americans who lectured Germans about Nazi racial ideology while enforcing segregation at home. Yet, despite these contradictions, or perhaps because of them, the POW experience remained transformative for many Germans. They saw American flaws, certainly, but they also saw American strengths: industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, technological innovation, democratic resilience, and, however imperfectly applied, commitment to the rule of law. These observations shaped post-war Germany in subtle but significant ways. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, incorporated elements consciously borrowed from American constitutionalism. The separation of powers, the federal system, the protection of individual rights, all reflected lessons German leaders had learned, partly through observation of American society by former POWs who became political actors. This wasn't American cultural imperialism exactly. Germany wasn't forced to adopt these principles. It chose them, recognizing their value through experience. The Marshall Plan helped economically, but the ideological transformation had deeper roots, extending back to those strange years when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers lived as captives in American camps, learning by observation and experience that democracy could work. Conclusion: the unexpected sight. When German POWs reached America between 1943 and 1945, they encountered a nation that violated every expectation their propaganda had created. They expected devastation and found prosperity. They expected hatred and found grudging respect. They expected cruelty and found adherence to international law. They expected to suffer and instead lived better than they had as free soldiers in the Wehrmacht. This cognitive dissonance was painful, even traumatic. It forced them to confront the reality that everything their government had told them was false. The enemy wasn't weak or degenerate. The war wasn't justified by historical necessity. The cause they'd fought for wasn't noble or righteous. Germany had committed atrocities while claiming to defend civilization, and Germany had lost, not through bad luck or betrayal, but because it had challenged nations with superior resources, organization, and values. These realizations didn't happen immediately. Propaganda's grip is strong, especially when reinforced by years of indoctrination and the social pressure of fellow believers. But day by day, meal by meal, interaction by interaction, the old certainties eroded. What replaced them was more complex, more nuanced, less satisfying emotionally, but more accurate intellectually. For some, like Hans Müller, this transformation was complete and lasting. They returned to Germany as different men, carrying seeds of democracy that would help reshape their nation. For others, the change was partial or temporary, and for a minority, no change occurred at all. They left America as convinced Nazis as they'd arrived, interpreting everything through the lens of their ideology. But even that minority couldn't deny the basic facts. America had housed, fed, and paid 425,000 German prisoners for years without collapsing economically or suffering security crises. It had treated them according to international law, not from weakness, but from strength. It had demonstrated that a democratic, multicultural, capitalist society could function effectively even under the stress of global war. That demonstration, more than any lecture or film or re-education program, was the most unusual sight German POWs encountered in America. They saw a working alternative to the totalitarian system they'd served. And for many, seeing was believing. The long-term consequences rippled through decades. Former POWs became fathers, teachers, business leaders, politicians. They raised children in democratic West Germany who never knew Nazi rule. They supported European integration and Atlantic alliance. They helped build the economic miracle that transformed West Germany from ruins to prosperity. They remembered their time in American camps not with bitterness, but with complicated gratitude, grateful for survival, for lessons learned, for second chances. In 2017, Günter Grave, age 91, returned to Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. As a young POW in 1944, he'd been held at Camp Lewis. He'd picked apples in eastern Washington, harvested potatoes, and had that moment of revelation standing before the camp canteen, choosing between Coca-Cola and ice cream. "I wanted to come back to say thank you," he told the American officers who greeted him. "Thank you for treating me like a human being when you didn't have to. Thank you for feeding me and keeping me safe. Thank you for showing me that there was a better way than what Hitler offered. I am alive today, and I lived a good life because you captured me instead of killing me." It was a remarkable statement, almost incomprehensible, a man thanking his former captors. But it encapsulated something profound about the German POW experience in America. Captivity, which should have been punishment, became education. Imprisonment, which should have bred resentment, sometimes fostered understanding. War, which brings out humanity's worst, occasionally reveals its better angels. The sight that greeted German POWs in America was unusual indeed. A nation powerful enough to defeat them, but civilized enough to treat them with dignity. That sight changed lives, influenced nations, and helped shape the post-war order in ways that no one expected or planned. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The United States treated German POWs well primarily for pragmatic reasons, to comply with international law and ensure reciprocal treatment of American prisoners. But that pragmatism, that adherence to rules even when inconvenient, that commitment to standards beyond immediate necessity demonstrated core values more effectively than any propaganda campaign could. The most unusual sight, in the end, was seeing values in action. Principles applied, not just proclaimed. Rights respected, not just theorized. Democracy practiced, not just preached. That sight stayed with them, those German soldiers who became prisoners and then witnesses. It stayed with them through the long journey home, through the difficult years of reconstruction, through the remainder of their lives, and through them, it helped shape a better world than the one they'd known. Not perfect, not without contradictions and failures and ongoing struggles, but better, more just, more free, more committed to human dignity. All because once, during a terrible war, hundreds of thousands of young German men came to America as prisoners and discovered, to their infinite surprise, that everything they'd been taught about the enemy was wrong. That discovery, repeated 425,000 times in 700 camps across 45 states, was perhaps the most unusual sight of the entire war. And it mattered. God help us all, it mattered.